Hello. Hello, Duchess Emma. Hello, everyone. Hello, Chanel. Um, Thank you for joining me tonight. I will wait a few minutes till we have more people watching us, and I'm sure we will have our guest of honor joining us in a few minutes. But meanwhile, I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everyone is having a good week. We're still in very much of a turbulent time, but everybody's thinking positive, so am I. And I'm just glad to see everyone to join us and to stay tuned. We just have a few more minutes to go, and I will welcome our guest to our conversation, and then I will have a few words about the conversations with Olga. Some of you have been listening to me for so many sessions already, some of you are new, so I'll just still repeat myself and tell you what my conversations are all about. Hello, Julie. And then we'll move forward. I will tell a few words about Abby, and then we will just move into a very fascinating conversation. Here you go, Abby. I can see her. I will just welcome her. Let's wait till she connects to us.
Hi.
Hello.
Good morning. Good evening to you. Good morning
Good
to me.
morning.
How is everything? The lighting, the sound.
The lighting is great. I like the color of your lipstick, and it
Thank
just, yeah,
you.
yes.
Let me just say, I'm not paid to say this, but this lipstick is actually called Eve, which is
Oh,
my
really?
Hebrew middle name, Chava, and the name of my book. Yes.
Amazing.
Um, it's like
Amazing.
friends of mine. Their company is called Fempower Beauty. You can see them on my page. Again, not paid. They just really good friends, and they created that. So thank you.
Amazing.
Also, I do want to let you know we might get a lot of haters. I apologize in advance.
Don't worry. Well, you're kind of a controversial person for many of the people, so I
Well,
wouldn't be surprised.
there's a saying that I heard a while ago, which is goes something along the lines: if the haters whine, you're doing fine. You know, when people whine and complain, you're doing fine. To me, so much of what we're doing, and I assume it might come up in the conversation later. I sometimes joke that my first mission of activism was that I wanted the Hasidic community that I grew up in to become transphobic, which is weird because I don't want anyone to be transphobic. But originally, I came from a community and a culture where they never even discussed people like me.
Exactly.
So
And we
for
will move
me,
into
just
it, and
have
I want to hear all about it. Abby, if you can just sit a little bit away from the screen and just, yes, exactly.
now
That's
give me a
perfect.
second. Let me just adjust it.
And if you don't move too much in and out, then it will be
How's it?
perfect.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Fabulous. Well, welcome. I will say a few words about Conversations with Olga, and we'll give our listeners, our viewers, a short biography of you, and then we'll move into conversations. And
Okay.
so many
Let's do
times,
it.
it's okay? Sounds good, okay. And it's very impromptu, and just like you and me converse the way we usually do. So, welcome everyone, and good evening, my Asian, my Singaporean friends, and good morning, my friends in America and East Coast, and good afternoon, our friends in Europe. Welcome very much. I'm opening my conversations with Olga yet for another time. Today is a session, actually episode number 16, and I will say a few words about the series. I've started Conversations with Olga during the circuit breaker last year. It is an IGTV series fostering intellectual and cultural exchange between influential and extraordinary individuals from all around the world. They're all sharing their personal life story and in hopes to inspire and to cultivate a more diverse and inclusive community. I'm excited for to introduce today's guest for my episode, an extraordinary person, Abby Stein. Abby, I'll say a few words about you, as I said. Abby is a Jewish educator, a rabbi, author, speaker, and an activist. Abby was born and raised in a Hasidic family of rabbinic descent in Brooklyn, New York. Isolated in culture that lives according to the laws and practices of the 18th century Eastern Europe, speaking only Yiddish and Hebrew and shining altogether modern life. As the first son in a dynamic rabbinical family, Abby poised to become a leader of the next generation of Hasidic Jews. But Abby felt certain at a young age that she was a girl. She suppressed her desire for a new body while looking for answers wherever she could find them, from forbidden religious texts to smuggled secular examinations of faith. Finally, you, Abby, orchestrated a personal exodus, not only from the ultra-Orthodox manhood in general, but from the ultra-Orthodox manhood to the mainstream femininity. It's completely a radical choice, and that forced you to leave your home, to leave your family, and basically the whole way of life. Since coming out, you have been working to raise support and awareness to the trans rights and those living in general ultra-Orthodox communities. Your story have been covered in New York Times, in New York Post, in Daily Mail, and Wall Street Journal, in New York Magazine, in Jewish Daily Forward, you name it, everywhere. And you've been a guest, you had live appearances on CNN, on Fox News, on HuffPost, Showtime, nowadays Pop Sugar, and anywhere else and everywhere else. This is what I was able to find. You studied gender studies and political science in Columbia University in New York, and you wrote a memoir, Becoming Eve, My Journey from Ultra-Orthodox Rabbi to a Transgender Woman a few years back. Abby, don't disappear on me, because now it's... okay, here you go. Yes, can you show us again? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and here you go. And we'll talk about this book a bit later on. I met Abby a few years ago when she came to Singapore, and I've attended one of her incredible talks. So today it's my privilege and honor to welcome you, Abby, to Conversations with Olga. And we'll start with basically a bit of a knowledge of a Hasidic community. You know, some of us actually...
Can I just jump in to say thank you for having me? And yeah, I obviously remembered. I know when you reached out, you weren't sure if I still remembered you, but you definitely made an impact. I met like hundreds of people in Singapore, but you definitely made an impact, and I'm really grateful. I watched some of your other episodes, and I'm really grateful for what you're doing, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Great. And, I would like you to share a little bit of general information about the Hasidic community. You know, lately, actually in the past several years, TV series Chisel and Unorthodox, the movie Unorthodox, have been extremely popular. So many people actually know about the community, but not all. Can you share with us what it's all about? Tell us about this community.
Well, I think it's hard to, in the context of like a video where we have like about an hour, it's quite hard to talk everything about a community. Here's what I will say. First, I want to make a disclaimer. I'm not trying in any way to say that my experience is the experience of everyone who grew up in the ultra-Orthodox or in the Hasidic communities. I am obviously only talking about my own experience. I will say, however, that the way I grew up is relatively, let's call that mainstream of the way many Hasidic people, especially in New York City, and I would say also in Israel, my dad is from Israel, how these communities live. So it's definitely not everyone's story, but my family wasn't relatively that much more radical than everyone else. I just wanted to put that out there. So I think a good way of thinking of the Hasidic community for people who know nothing about the Hasidic community is to imagine that there's a lot of cultures who shun the outside world. Specifically in the US, for example, there's a lot of like fundamentalist communities. And people are like, I think the US media specifically almost have like an obsession with like fundamentalist communities. But when it comes to the Hasidic community, and specifically for kids and teenagers, for us, it wasn't growing up that the culture of the outside world was forbidden. Take TV shows, for example. So it wasn't like, oh, we had a list of TV shows and I'm like, oh, we can't watch all of this. Or like music, it wasn't like I had a list of pop culture bands and I was like, I don't know, I grew up in the 90s, so I sometimes use the Backstreet Boys as an example, whatever it was. It wasn't that we were aware of the outside world and that it was forbidden. It was that we were raised in a culture where, as kids and teenagers, most of us were unaware of the outside world. Our education system is another good example, specifically for kids who go to boys-only schools. And I'm saying that with quotation marks because obviously we'll talk a bit more about gender later, but at least let's put this on the side. But if you go to education is separated by gender, like everything else. The Hasidic community, and again, we're talking mostly, I'm talking about boys and teenagers and young adults because that's when I left as a young adult. Albeit, again, that experience doesn't change later. They don't magically become less gender segregated. But I do think that there's adult people, there are people in their late 20s and 30s that just do whatever they want, which is a separate conversation. So just putting that out there. Education-wise, my English education was maybe a third grade level at best, and math, very similar, like long division is a good example. That was the farthest we ever got to study math, and that was it. We never had social studies.
What was expected of you while you were growing up? Actually, what did your predictable future look like?
Yeah, I want to just say that one thing about education, like, and I think that's very important. We never had any science education. We never had any history education. We never had any social studies. That wasn't even on the menu, so to speak. It wasn't on the curriculum. They never attempted to even teach it. It was expected for you to very much follow, what's the word in English I'm looking for, but like follow the path, so to speak, like do exactly what you were told to. For everyone from a really young age, we're raised with this idea of getting married young, having big families. That is true for everyone, regardless if you were a boy or a girl. But very importantly, you're told that every second of every day has to be focused on, well, supposedly worshiping Hashem or worshiping God or focusing on the divine. But in reality, there's a stronger focus on following the very strict rules. Like if you, for example, casually start talking about like questions that you might have about even God, for example, you just ask questions quietly. You might get into some trouble. You're not going to get kicked out of the community. If you start dressing differently, that's going to get you kicked out. So much of the community ends up being focused around the almost external, like follow the path, dress the same way, speak the same language, do the same, like follow the same path of like, you're born. I say like if you're a boy, you get like your payas, like the side curls that Hasidic boys have at age 3. You get bar mitzvah at age 13 and hopefully engaged and married at age 18 and then have a lot of babies. Kind of like follow that path, don't stray from it. And then like in terms of what you can do for jobs or for a living, for example, many Hasidic people, specifically in the US, do work outside of the community. But for example, going to college is extremely shunned, extremely frowned upon. It is a growing number, but I would still say, if I say 5% of Hasidic people go to college, that's probably a really high number. You're encouraged not to do that. And like just for boys, it's like sit in yeshiva and study until you get married. For girls, it's like past 12th grade. Yes, maybe get a job either in the community or like maybe even working outside, but ultimately the goal is to stay in the community and have a family. And then that's kind of like the pattern. Like I will say, like, one of the things that my family had that was relatively more strict is for us, we were also expected to get a job, let's call that in the field of Judaica, in the field either of Judaic studies. Like, for example, my dad, for my entire life, my dad was teaching at a yeshiva. To explain, I'm not going to go into explain exactly what a yeshiva is. Obviously, people can look it up, but it's like a mix of a high school, seminary, sometimes rabbinical school, whatever people have. So did both of my grandparents. Most of my uncles were working either as rabbis or as rabbinical judges or as working for religious institutions and so on. So I was very much expected to take on some rabbinical role. And then personally, I did go kind of like out of my way to get ordained, which would be called kind of like let's call it just smicha. It's a combination of several different processes, which I did start it out. I kind of like got ordained, so to speak, or did the exams needed for that when I was 19, and that was very much expected of me. Let's just say going to college was kind of not expected in the community and very shunned upon and very frowned upon. And in my family specifically, doing anything that wasn't within the religious field was extremely frowned upon.
Thank you. Talking about your families, did you have anyone in your family that you were particularly close and whom you were able to confide in and who could understand you at least partially?
Well, so will see my family life, and as anyone who reads my book will see, I was very careful not to be like, oh, the Hasidic community is terrible and they have nothing good. Obviously, I think there are some positive parts in the community, and whatever it is, charity or whatever it is, family lives and so on. I obviously think the negative parts outweigh the positive parts. But I did have, so one of the very positive things of my experience has been the very close family relationships. My parents were relatively and legitimately like loving and caring. My mom has 13 kids, and she spoke, at least last I spoke to her, she was still speaking to most of her kids every single day. My mom cooked meals, 3 meals for each and every one of us at home forever since I remember, taking care not just of our family, but of so many people around us. People are always like, oh, how did it feel to grow up as one of 13? Or like now, 11 of my siblings are married. I think my parents have somewhere around 50 grandkids, but we never felt like a number. We always felt like really loved. And I had a very good relationship. I think with my mom a bit more than with my dad, but relatively with both of them. However, it wasn't the kind of relationship where I could talk about whatever I want. In my book, I talk about that experience that I had at age 4. I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not gonna go into too much detail, but it was an experience where I tried to take matters into my own hand, literally and physically. And my mom kind of caught me doing that and was like asking what is going on, and kind of like trying to like ask me like I should tell her why I would do something like that. And I tried telling her, but the reaction that I got was more of a religious reaction. It was almost like getting a reaction from a religious figure as opposed to from a mom, which was very much like, don't talk about this. This is not something you can ever discuss, and so on. So even that very close relationship with my family had its limits. And even later, as I was leaving the community, so I got married at 18 and I have a son who was born when I was 19.
Yeah, we will talk about it. We'll talk about it.
But then even as I left and I was having very open conversations with my dad, again, relatively, there were still certain things that he wouldn't want to discuss with me. There was still like places where he stopped and like, this is a red line, and so on. So, and then also there's the thing where this love and this very close relationship with my family was very conditional. I like to tell people that there's no such a thing as unconditional love. There's only love, because love that is conditional is not really love. So in many ways, when I think about my family, there was a lot of conditions attached to that love and support from the family and community. And that is an existential problem, if I may say.
But at this point, do you have any friends from the Hasidic community that you socialize from your past?
I do, not a lot. And to be honest, I have so many amazing friends. I have some, and I'm great and happy with that. I'm not actively looking out to make more friends. Like I sometimes joke that I specifically now during COVID that I have too many friends to keep up with on a day-to-day basis. And I love my friends that have such an amazing support network. But I do have some. I have 2 siblings that I'm close with. I have 1 sibling specifically that I'm really close with. We speak like a few times a week. And then there's some siblings less so, but then I have cousins that I'm close with. I always like to tell people that I focus on the positive. I have 2 siblings and 10 cousins that I'm close with. Most people my age who did not grow up in a religious community, it's like 2 siblings and 10 cousins is a nice family. So that's what I choose to focus on, as opposed to on the people who don't want to talk to me and the people who don't want to be in touch with me. So yeah.
That's part of life. And let's move a little bit into the face.
Although if I may just jump in to say, because I see there's like one person specifically is just being annoying. You can kick people out if you want. You can just click on their name and like remove them, but just saying.
Yeah, okay. See,
I'm
I'm
fine.
not very familiar with the technology in par. You're probably better than me, but if it's, I don't really pay attention, but if you want,
Okay.
I can
Good.
try to do
No,
that.
I don't mind. I'm fine. I'm just
Okay,
saying if it
okay. It
bothers you.
doesn't, it's fine. That's life, and everybody is entitled to their own opinions, and I guess expressing them the way they feel, so that's fine. I'm just ignoring it. I'm talking to you, not to really to anyone else at the moment. So what is your relationship with space?
Faith is a very strong word.
It is.
I sometimes say that I have no faith, and sometimes I have a lot of faith. It's the same thing when people ask me about God. I'm like, I've gotten that question a lot, and I've done like hundreds of in-person events, whatever, like physically in person or
Yeah, that would have
virtually
been
in
my
person.
question as well. What is your view and relationship with religion? Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So when someone asks me if I believe in God, I usually respond with, first define to me what do you mean by believe? There's different forms of like believing blindly in something, relating to something, having an experience with. What do you mean by belief? And what do you mean by God? It's not just that there have been millions of gods that people around the world have believed in, but even within Judaism, they're very different. Even with the Hasidic Judaism, there are very different definitions of what exactly God is and God means. So I tell people, listen, if you're talking about God as the God that I grew up with, which is kind of ironic because if you study Hasidic teachings, you see that that is not the God they believe in, but the God that I grew up with in the contemporary Hasidic community that I was raised in was very much what I call the boogeyman in the sky. It was this like scary thing who like, I don't know, you flip a light switch on Friday night on Shabbat and God is going to get very angry. Or this like, it was almost this like rod that was used to hit you with. You better behave because otherwise God is going to punish you. It was a very scary God. If that is the God that people talk about, and I think a lot of people would call that the Abrahamic or monotheistic God from an academic perspective, if that's your God, I'm an atheist and proud of it. However, if you want to talk about God as a word, as a way that people use, a word that people use to relate to the world as a whole, to relate to something beyond ourselves, or like one of my favorite definitions, which is one explored by Rabbi Art Green in his book Radical Judaism, and it's actually based on Hasidic teachings, which is this concept of that the four-letter Hebrew name for God actually means being. Imagine being a capital B, being
Yeah.
existence. And in some Hasidic teachings, you also see that this concept of a sum total of existence, and you can even think about it from a scientific perspective, where at the core of everything, we're all made up, like for people who might know scientific terms, of like we're all made up of like atoms, which at its core boil down to the exact same thing. So there is definitely something, whatever you think of it in a spiritual or a physical way, that ultimately something unifies the world, and many people will use the terms God that we have both in religion and in Judaism and so on to relate to that. And some people call that God. In Judaism, we call that either Hashem or Adonai or Elohim. In Christianity, they might have given it different names. And in Islam, in Arabic-speaking countries, they might have called it Allah. And in Hinduism, they had hundreds and millions of different names for that.
Yes,
And I
that's
think
very
the
true.
point is, I want to say something that one of my teachers, who's considered his name's Reb Zalman Schachter Shalom, he's considered the founder of Jewish Renewal. He used to say, and I think he quoted it from someone, that every religion, every practice, not just religion specifically, every spiritual practice in the world is like a finger pointing at a specific, like let's imagine a finger pointing at the sun. And far too often, humanity gets bogged down about how someone's finger looks, which shape it is, which color it is, how it's decorated, or are you pointing a finger, or are you just looking, are you not looking directly, instead of where we are really pointing to. So for me, when it comes to, I don't prefer not to use the word faith, but rather something I relate to,
Yeah.
is this idea where at the end of the day, there is something that really brings us all together, whatever you're looking at scientifically, whatever you're looking at on the reality of the world. A good example would be like climate change, for example. It's very easy to be like, oh, but I'm not doing anything. Like how it's not, I don't own a massive oil company that is destroying the planet. Ultimately, we all live on the same planet. There's a Hasidic story that goes that someone, and I think it comes in other cultures as well, that someone is sitting on a boat and starts drilling a hole under his seat. And everyone is like, what are you doing? All the water's going to come and we're going to sink. And that person's like, it doesn't impact all of you. I'm doing it at my seat. Ultimately, it's a reality that we all share the same planet. We all share the same resources, and we are all connected. And to me, spirituality and spiritual and religious practices are a way of relating to that.
Yeah. So that's, yeah, that's actually spirituality. And another question that I have for you related to that, probably in a lighter subject, are traditions. I embrace traditions and I love traditions very much, and Jewish traditions are very, very important to me. I'm not, I must admit, a very religious person at all, but I love Jewish traditions. So what about you? Can you tell me um, whether you're sort of embracing traditions more than any particular religious aspects, and why?
Well, I love how you're saying it. You love tradition. To me, it's always whenever someone asks me, "Oh, are you observant?" I'm like, "No, I don't observe anything. I don't observe Judaism. I celebrate. I
Yeah,
celebrate." And I think like I don't observe Shabbat. I celebrate Shabbat, and I love it. I think there are so many messages, and I'm obviously thinking of Judaism specifically, but I think you can find that in every different cultures. But for me, there's so many important messages in Judaism that are beautiful, regardless. Like let me give you an example. Shabbat, as I mentioned before, specifically candle lighting. I took on Shabbat candle lighting a bit more than 6 years ago. I did it not for religious reasons. It wasn't like, oh, there's like, to use that term I used before, there's a boogeyman in the sky. There's a God who's going to get really angry if I don't do it. I was going through a really hard time at that time. It was before I came out. I needed something nice to do. I needed something beautiful. I needed something to ground me. And I felt like doing that Friday night, and at the time it was like, I light Shabbat candles and I do something to celebrate on Friday night. It could have meant
so
going
it's a
to a
ritual. It's a ritual. It's a tradition.
yeah, and it could be going to a service,
Yeah.
it could be going to a meal, or it could be going
Yeah.
to a bar with friends or to go watch a
Yes.
movie with friends. I don't care. It's like forcing myself to do something, and it was extremely, I would say it got me through some of the hardest times. So I think so many traditions, I think it's important to look on it from the perspective of we need to make it our own. We need to look, specifically in Judaism, whatever religious people like to hear that or not, the reality is that religious practice and customs have constantly evolved and constantly changed. We have some core traditions and we look on that and we need to find ways of making that speak to us if that's what you choose. I'm not in the business of making anyone to be more religious or less
Yeah.
religious, more practicing, less practicing. That's not my goal in the world.
Sure.
But I
But
always tell people my goal is that if you want to practice, if you want to follow traditions, I want you to know that there's ways to do that in your own way. And ultimately, as I said before, to me personally, what really appeals to me is this idea of celebrating it as opposed to just be like, oh, I have to do something, but rather
yeah,
this is so
should not
meaningful.
be an obligation. But you
Exactly.
know, you, Abby, you're the rabbi. You are actually practicing rabbi. Am I correct? And what are the
Well,
oh,
yeah. So for a long time, I did not. For a long
okay,
time, after I left, and like I have, people will always like love to argue about it, whatever, because I only worked for a very short time as a rabbi in the Hasidic community. But in reality, like I have like a religious rabbinical donation. I even have like the yeshiva that I went to, the accredited institution. I even have like an accredited kind of like rabbinical degree. But then after I left, for a host of reasons, I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I used to joke with people that if you're going to call me a rabbi, I'm going to punch you. I'm not. I don't want to punch people, but I'm just like, I was really not in it. And I think it was a combination of several things. There's the fact that many people in my life, like the only rabbis I know in my life were men. And it doesn't matter that today, and it took me a long time to get to that point, but today I know more female rabbis than male rabbis by
yeah,
choice, but that is still a reality. And also like the fact that I felt like I didn't get the general kind of like education that pretty much all rabbinical students outside of the Orthodox world. So in the US, for example, according to Wikipedia, take it with a grain of salt, but that's around the numbers, somewhere between 75 to 80% of ordained rabbis in the US are not Orthodox. So if you go to a conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal, whatever rabbinical school you go to, you end up getting a lot of pastoral training, a lot of training on how to work with people and so on. I didn't get that in the Hasidic community. So that was another reason why I didn't feel like I wanted to re-embrace the rabbinate, so to speak, or to work as a
okay,
rabbi, to become a rabbi.
sure.
However, over the summers, it was 2 summers specifically, 2018 and 2019, I spent like my summer studying with hundreds of rabbis that are around the world. I did several different programs, kind of like working with many other rabbis, kind of filling in a lot of the kind of like educational gaps that I felt I had. And then slowly, specifically over the past 2 years, I have found that I could do a lot of good as a rabbi to focus more on that education. I created online, and they're publicly available to everyone, for example, like 50 different like source sheets and curriculums based on Jewish text, using my rabbinical education to educate people mostly about LGBTQ issues in Judaism, but also to go beyond that. I'm currently a member of several different rabbinical groups, and yes, I do a lot. By now, I do a lot of work as a rabbi. And it ultimately all boils down to, I guess, very, very similar to what I've said before. I'm not trying to get people to be religious or less religious or being religious in a specific way, but I am trying to show people that if you want to practice our traditions and culture in whichever way that is, don't ever let anyone tell you that you cannot be Jewish and LGBTQ, you cannot be Jewish and fully be who you are, but rather to create rituals, to create examples for people to be able to live their full lives within our traditions and cultures and make it their own.
Thank you. Thank you so much for expressing your thoughts and your passions and your views. I would like to move a little bit, I guess, more into the personal
Sure.
world of yours. You were married before. First of all,
Yeah.
what is your take on marriage as an institution? And tell us a little bit about that journey of yours.
You mean marriage as an institution outside of the Hasidic community, just marriage as a whole?
Marriage, well, let's talk about, since we're talking about a particular community, let's talk about the marriage as an institution in the Hasidic community. And as I said, many of us have seen the movies, and many of us kind of have some knowledge of relationship between man and a wife. What was your take, and how was it for you to get married, and what was it all about?
I'm actually glad you brought up unorthodox, because I actually want to say something. Because one of the biggest like arguments supposedly that I saw against unorthodox were people who grew up in, let's say, Orthodox, a lot of them modern Orthodox communities, or like even like ultra-Orthodox communities that were less radical than the kind of like some, or like the Williamsburg Hasidic communities. They were like, oh, but that wasn't my experience. And I think when a lot of people missed with unorthodox, there wasn't in any way attempting to say this is the story of the Hasidic community, but rather this is the story of one specific woman. And I will say, I watched the sex ed, this education that like Esti and Yankee are getting in unorthodox. And frankly, I got even less than that, me and my ex and most of my siblings. And I know many people got married. I actually got a phone call because I had the privilege to be a bit aware and kind of like involved. I was on set of unorthodox many times. One of my close friends was involved, was like the consultant. Yeah, and I wrote an article about that with some pictures of me on set. I'm in the background. It's 2 episodes as well in unorthodox. Anyway, but after it came out, a friend of mine called me up who grew up who I went to yeshiva with, and they were like, oh my God, like the sex ed? Where did they get it so much? Like we got so much less sex education than that. I just wanted to put that out there. Obviously, yes, there are communities that do more, but the way kind of like in Williamsburg, that is a very stereotypical sex education. Now, what do I think about marriage? I had a conversation yesterday with a cousin of mine who I'm really close with from childhood. He's still in the Hasidic community, but we talk a lot. He's very open-minded. And we were talking about some people, obviously I'm not going to name names, and we got to this point where we realized that for far too many people, and obviously I've known that for a long time, but far too many people, and I don't want to put a number on it, but if I have to guesstimate, make an educated guess, I would say anywhere around 50% of people don't really get along with their spouses in these communities. And by that I mean, yes, they might just live their life, they might just move like in their day-to-day lives and have a lot of kids and then raise these kids, sometimes even good, without really getting along, without really any love being there. And I know some people might think that, okay, maybe marriage is not about love. Well, I'm sorry to say, but I harshly disagree with you, and I feel bad for you almost. I think, so the Hasidic community does arrange marriages. Now, I'm not even going to focus on kids or teens younger than 18, so like people who are not even adults getting married, which is a terrible thing that is actually that happens all the time. I have a first cousin of mine who leads a very relatively controversial yeshiva in Williamsburg, who's been in the news lately for marrying 15 to 16-year-olds. That is a terrible problem, and there's actually someone who grew up Hasidic who founded an organization called Unchained at Last that is working on that. I'm not even going to go into that. So let's talk about teenagers in their 18, 19 years all getting married. I think that is hands
This is
down.
the age when you got married, didn't you? You got
Yeah,
married when you were
that
18.
is all of my siblings. My parents are now up to 12 of the 13 kids who were married, well, 11 are still married, and I was married. None of us reached 19 single. We were all got married at teenagers, literally every single one of them. Some of us got engaged at 17, some at 18, but we all, by the time we reached 19, we were all engaged or married. And it's not just the fact that it's young marriages. It is arranged and
Yeah.
arranged by the parents. And it's not like being set up on a blind date. Frankly, it's not even what's called shidduch dating that a lot of ultra-Orthodox people outside of the Hasidic world, where like you're being set up with someone, you go on like 5 to 10 dates, and then you decide. We don't even have a single date. We have something called a basho, which I think is a Yiddish word, which means for showing or seeing. And you meet, but the joke of it is that like 90% or so of 18-year-old Hasidic kids, both boys and girls, who meet with someone for that one time where you can supposedly say yes or no, and hypothetically you can, but for most of us, it's the first time you meet someone who's being raised in the opposite gender. You know absolutely nothing about life. Forget about marriage, sex, love. You don't know what you're looking for. It's the person set up that your parents, because before the couple even meets, they don't meet until the parents have both decided that they're going for it. And unfortunately, more often than not, the first thing that matchmakers will match in the Hasidic community will be families as opposed to couples.
Yeah.
And 90% of people who meet already get engaged. That would be like saying 90% of people go on first dates, get married. That is the reality in the Hasidic community I grew up in. And that's it. There's no like, to give you my personal example, I met my ex-wife, who also happened to be my like third or fourth cousin. We met at her sister's apartment in New York, in Brooklyn. We walked in kind of like we were like going to have that first initial meeting, which was kind of like 6 people. It was my parents and my ex's parents together sitting down. But we walked into that apartment, and on the countertop in the kitchen, I could already see there was like bottles of like brandy and schnapps and like cakes and
ready
cookies.
to congratulate.
Ready to congratulate, ready for the engagement, and we were going to meet now for the first time. It's that on its own is a big problem. Now, I'm not going to say that no one loves each other, but no one gets married of that, and some people fall in love later. I would say half of people, even more, never fall in love. To talk about my own parents, I think they kind of fell in love about 10 years ago. I was living back at home at the time, and I could watch it happen. After being married for 30 years. So I know many, obviously I know my grandparents, I know my aunts and uncles, and my siblings, 12 of them are married. Again, I can say a very educated guess that over 50% of Hasidic couples never find real love, whatever that is. And however you do.
It's because I believe, to be honest with you, me personally, I believe in the notion of family. And to me, it's a support system. But I also always felt that since we kind of do not really choose our family, parents and siblings, we are not necessarily obliged to have complete closeness with them. However, we by finding life partners and friends, we have an opportunity to choose. So this opportunity, when it's taken away from us, either in the beginning of the relationship or sometime later in life, I think is definitely something that I not in favor for sure. Abby,
100%.
and you're totally. I'm not totally okay if you say no to the question, but I would like to ask about your son and how did you feel to become a parent, and whether you have love for this child and whether you have any relationship at all. Once again, I'm not imposing any answers on you, but nevertheless, I'm posting the question.
Okay. Well, I can answer a bit about it. My policy, so to speak, my approach has always been, I don't want to talk about his life today. Like, I'm not going to tell anyone where he lives, how he lives, I think anything about his life today. It's important for me to keep that private. But I can talk a bit about, so here's the thing. I love my son more than anything else. Every person who knows me knows that. Every person that I meet today, I always tell every people I start dating or whatever it is, they all know that my first love, so to speak, is my son. nothing is going to change that. There's nothing in the world I wouldn't do to make it both the world and his life as best as I possibly could. So let me just put that out there.
That's
So
wonderful.
here's the thing. For me, having a son, having a child in general was a big turning point in my personal life. It is when I realized, I sometimes use the term gender began punching me in the face. At the time, I was, as I said, I was 19, early 20s. I was living in the Hasidic community. I didn't even know the term transgender. I didn't even know that other people like me exist, but I very much knew what I was feeling. I knew my own personal experience. And it was really hard for me. And I think one thing that the Hasidic community has in common with the outside world, which maybe they shouldn't, is that we gender babies sometimes before they're even conceived. You know, a couple is trying to have a baby and they're already talking about what gender the baby is going to be. You're preparing a nursery and like the colors of like blue or pink become like so prevalent, ignoring the fact that until like about 150 years ago, actually pink was considered masculine. But we're not going to go into all of these details right now. Gender is so present when it comes to having kids. And for me, that was really, really hard. It was kind of like a reflection of my own self. Ultimately, and I think another point is that it's not like you can take time. Oh, yes, I want to have a kid, but give me 5 years to prepare for it. You are told to get married and to get off birth control and to have kids as soon as possible, and then have as many babies as possible. So I think that is also important. I don't think that any teenager, regardless of how mature you are, is really best suited and ready to have kids. I do think some, yes, teenagers could still be good parents if they choose to focus a lot on that. For me, that was, I will also say, my son was the reason that I stayed in the community a year after I wasn't religious anymore. Yeah. I tried literally everything I could to make it work. And I didn't start the process of leaving the community until my ex and my son were taken away, partially by force. I'm going to talk a bit more about it in my second book. I didn't talk about it in the first book, both because this book is about growing up as opposed to the actual process of transition, and also the fact that I need to really find the right words to say it and the right way to talk about that. But that was the reality. I stayed, we went to therapists. I really tried to find a way to keep the family together, so to speak, even though that would have meant, obviously, forget about coming out and transition, which wouldn't have been an option. Even living a life that I believed in wouldn't have been an option, but I was ready to do that, to stay with my son. But after it was made very clear to me by my ex's family that they're going to do whatever they can to make sure I don't live with my son the whole time, only then I started leaving the community. And we got divorced. My ex and I, we got separated, and we were divorced like 3 months later. It was a very fast process, and my ex was already engaged and married less than a year after we got separated. Okay. So there's that.
Well,
I was very lucky.
Good for her, she moved on.
It was another arranged marriage, you know.
Yeah, I'm sure. I am sure.
But I also, with my son, I was lucky and privileged that my dad was still supporting me at the time. It was before I fully left the community. I managed to get what's called a 50-50 joint custody agreement with my son that is legally still in place. That is as much as I would say about my relationship with him today, because again, anything about his life today, I don't want to talk about that. That is important to keep.
Absolutely. So let's move into your actually transition. You know, I believe you must have been, first of all, a very determined and very curious and brave child. You know, you started to question the world, I believe, when you were very young, and you grew up in New York, yet you barely knew the city, and you were not even able to speak English, and yet you embraced.
Well, I didn't grow up in New York. I grew up in New York physically, geographically.
Yes, exactly. But you didn't know the city. Absolutely, absolutely. So the mere fact of breaking off from the ultra-Orthodox community and coming out openly as a transgender person, you have basically broken the whole stigma about both of these extremes. It's extraordinary, but when did you realize that you have to change your life? At which moment? How old were you?
Well, there were several different moments. Obviously, there was a moment I was 4 years old that I very consciously remember of like me being, I'm a girl in the world disagreeing with me. I would say another big moment was when I was around 12, which was the point when I realized, well, at the time I thought that I was the only person who has these thoughts and feelings, and like I never actually, people sometimes tell me, oh, you must have been struggling with gender. Ironically, I never really I knew who I was. I knew I was a girl, and I never even questioned that since I was really, really young. My struggle was, what do I do with it? How do I live that life?
Did you try to, sorry to interrupt, did you try to look for answers in some of your biblical studies and commentaries that you possibly could have find some answers?
So I did, so part of me, let me get back to the part of what I was saying when I was 12. So what happened then was, it kind of triggered that reality where everyone was claiming that I was a boy, me knowing that I was a girl. But that being, I would say, like at the time, as a preteen, I had two very big parts of identity that were forced on me. One was, you are an ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jew of a rabbinic family with a very strict path. And the other one was, you are a boy. Since I remember myself, I disagreed with the part of you are a boy. And then when I was around 12, and I remember that conscious decision of, hold on, if these people are so wrong about my gender, which is the one big part of my life, they could also be wrong about everything else. And here's what I would say. Teenagers rebel in every culture. There's teenage rebellion even in the Hasidic community. But I'm not aware, and I'm sure they are. I'm sure I wasn't the only one, but most Hasidic teenagers who rebel don't go like, oh, God doesn't exist. Everything is made up. They will rebel against certain rules, against certain practices. But for me, because so much of who I was challenged by the community, I got to this realization, I can't trust these people with anything. And that's when you mentioned that during the introduction. That's when I started to be like, okay, let me start. I need to find some answers. And I set out on a path. Originally at the time, I was trying to focus mostly about religion, because I knew obviously that there are many people who are not ultra-Orthodox. There are many Jews who are not ultra-Orthodox, and there are many people who are not Jewish. So I was obviously aware that there is life outside the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Judaism that I was raised with. I was still unaware that there's an LGBTQ community or that transgender people exist. So I focused on that, and it started out, and in my book, I named some of the books that I've read, and reading has always been a big part of that. I started out by reading religious texts that I wasn't supposed to, which was extremely easy because we had like long lists of stuff that we were not supposed to study. Started reading philosophical books, and then around age 15, again through a process that I explain in the book in more detail, I managed to get my hands on a lot of books. Let's call them secular books, whatever it was about biblical criticism, biblical scholarship, about like who really wrote the Bible from an academic perspective and so on. And as well, like philosophical books and books written by atheists and so on. All of that in Hebrew. I couldn't read English at the time, but I could read Hebrew. We spoke mostly on the Yiddish, but we used Hebrew a lot for reading and writing. And then an interesting kind of turning point, actually, of finding kind of like support in the text. There was a time when I was 15 and 16 when I was questioning everything, and I read enough to feel very comfortable to be like, this is all BS. I'm done with Judaism. I don't have to be religious anymore. And then almost like as a last Hail Mary, so to speak, I went to meet this Israeli Kabbalistic scholar, let's call him, who's Hasidic, but relatively, well, either you could call him open-minded or just has a more nuanced approach to everything. And I had a long conversation with him, and he encouraged me to get into Kabbalistic, to Jewish mystic studies, and study Jewish mysticism. And a lot of people, I know when I left, a lot of people were like, oh, you were not supposed to study Jewish mysticism when you're so young, that's why you left. But a lot of people are missing that if not for the fact that I found Jewish, like, mystic studies, I would have left when I was 15. It is actually what kind of kept me religious, relatively, kept me the community for a few years. And I got very into it and kind of like bought into it, so to speak, for a few years. But that was one of the first times hold on, I need to charge my phone. Give me just a second.
Thank you, everyone. Once again, I'm sorry I had to turn off the comments because there were just too many comments of all kinds. So I apologize for everyone who's listening and who's expressing themselves. It's not for mere reason, but just to have a little bit more of a concentrated discussion. So my apology once again for turning off the comments. Let's, Abby is charging her phone.
I'm trying to Give me a second. Trying to find a way to make this work. Oh, okay.
Great.
I might
Have it
have to hold
safe
it.
with some battery juice there?
Yeah, no, I need to connect the wire, and I can't really use the stand I've been using. Give me a
Okay,
second.
why don't we try to sort of speed it up and see whether we can make it still on the battery that you have?
Are you good now?
I can.
You
Okay.
can see?
I have a delay in your voice, Abby. So sorry.
Hold on, let me try. Should I try
can't
to
hear
leave and
you.
rejoin? Should I try to leave and rejoin?
Okay, try. I'm so sorry, everyone. Okay, we will try to join again with Abby. Just 1 second. See, technology these days, sometimes we need to troubleshoot a little bit. We're just waiting for Abby to join. So, my dear friends, I know that this is a very controversial subject, and Abby is a fascinating personality. So I am thanking you again for joining us and for. Um, I'm just waiting for Abby once again.
Sorry
Here
about
you
that.
go.
I couldn't find a way to request to join you again. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
You are here, my dear. So that's fine.
Great. Okay,
So
I'm so sorry
let's
about
move
it.
a little bit forward.
Okay.
There was no communication, almost no communication, obviously, with the outside community. How did you manage to, for example, to access the internet? And I know, for a fact, and you told me as well that your English was almost non-existent, and yet now you're a public speaker, which is incredible. How did you learn the language, and how? And I assume it is your first language right now. And just brief us on this a little bit.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's definitely my primary language. It's the language I use the most right now. I will say I still read and sometimes find myself writing in Hebrew almost subconsciously. And I pretty much I'm conversational in 5 languages today. I started studying English on my own. So we studied ABCs, but that is it. I've talked about the education system before. By the time in the school that I went to, by the time our English education ended in 8th grade, I don't think there was a single student who could speak conversational English. Forget about being really fluent. So with the internet, you mentioned internet before. I knew everything about the internet because the Hasidic community has been on a fight against the internet for the last like 25 years or so, which sounds really weird, but they were hardcore trying to fight it. So I knew about the internet. I knew it's a place where you can find answers for certain questions because they were constantly talking about how you can find like heresy and like terrible things on the internet. So for me, that meant, oh, okay, this is a place I can find some answers to my questions. I knew, for example, about Wi-Fi and how it works because from what we were told not to do, or like we were told, for example, that if you buy, let's say, a digital camera, which in most Hasidic communities you're totally allowed to have that, you should still take it into this like organization to make it kosher, to make sure you don't have an internet connection. Or like I even had a phone that was a kosher phone, so to speak. So it was kind of like not a smartphone, but it was a phone with like a full keyboard. But it kind of could have internet access. It was like this old-fashioned, like pre-smartphone internet, but it was still internet. So like I had to take it in to a company that would like block it. They put in like some software to block it. And we were told that even if you don't, let's say you don't have a data plan, you don't have internet, you still need to do that because God forbid you could connect to Wi-Fi. So I knew that is exactly how I knew how Wi-Fi worked. And then when I was getting to this point, I was starting to say before, like there was this one point when I was 16, when I was almost left, got into Jewish mysticism, even found some Jewish mystic texts that talk about my experience, which I talk in the book. But then, so this was right after my son was born, and I felt, as I mentioned before, it was like punching me in the face, and I needed to find some answers.
Answers,
And after
yeah.
I couldn't find that in books and I couldn't find that in the community, I knew that the internet is the only kind of like it's the next option. And at the time I managed, so I bought her a tablet from a friend who didn't have a plan on, like, it didn't have internet access on it, but it was never blocked, which meant that if I took it to a place where there was a Wi-Fi connection, I could connect to it. And so I
So
did that.
Abby, you were street smart. You were street smart kid,
Yeah,
for
well,
sure.
I knew my way around the world, so
Yeah.
to speak, if I wanted to. Yes, I knew how to live my life. And that was kind of my first exposure to the internet, which ultimately the first thing that I Googled ever was whatever a boy can turn into a girl. Which was very interesting for me because it was that was the day I learned that, like, I remember sitting, and that was like as a public bathroom in a mall that had Wi-Fi, and like sitting there and reading and being like, oh my God, I'm not alone. There are millions of people all around the world with similar experiences, and how, well, it was emotional and amazing, but also terrifying at the same time, because suddenly I realized I could actually do something about it. But that was kind of like the start. And then, like, I wanted to learn, I did all of that in Hebrew. Like, I was reading a lot on Hebrew Wikipedia. I got active on an online forum, an Israeli forum called Tapuz, which means an orange in Hebrew. I have no idea why that was the name of that forum. But on there was a forum in Hebrew for trans people. There was another forum on that same website that was for people who grew up ultra-Orthodox and either who are not religious but are still in the closet, so to speak, they still live religious lives, or people who have left the ultra-Orthodox community, and so on. So I slowly started talking with people that I wanted to learn English. So what I started doing is, I knew, as I mentioned, like, I knew some of the ABCs, so I knew like the very bare minimum to be able to start. I watched many, like, hours and hours of YouTube videos that were teaching that were teaching English for Hebrew speakers. So I would say that was the big stage. That got me over, like, the hardest part of, like, getting to a point where I was conversational, where I could read enough. I remember, like, for the first time forcing myself to read a full book in English, how I was sitting.
Let me interrupt you for a second. It was all done in hiding, isn't it?
All of it was done in hiding, in
Okay.
bathrooms and in,
Yes.
well, also there was a time when after my son was born, and my ex spent a lot of time at my ex-in-laws. So I had like our apartment to myself. So I spent some time there, but I still like slept at my in-laws' house at a time every night. So there wasn't that much time, but I could get a few hours a day on my own, kind of like with the internet.
Were you
like,
fearful at that time? Did you have a lot of fears?
there was always the concern of, like, getting caught, so to speak, but the need and, like, the survival, so to speak. So, like, in many ways, survival instincts kicked in, because it wasn't like I had an option of not exploring that or exploring that. For me, it was either exploring that, getting into, like, finding my life, learning about the LGBTQ community, learning English, learning about, let's call that, secular life, or not having a life, whatever that meant. So it was kind of, yes, there were risks. Yes, I was always afraid of being caught, but the advantages way outweigh the risk.
So what was the precipitating moment? When did this actually happen, that you physically walked out of the house, out of the community?
It wasn't like that. I know a lot of people expect a very dramatic TV-like runaway, like unorthodox. It's not how it worked. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I actually didn't walk out of the house. My ex and my son were pretty much taken partially by force. Again, I'm gonna discuss that more in my second book. Taken away from me, and I actually continued living in our house for a few months after that, while I was still hoping that maybe I will work it out, and maybe I will be able to live with my son full time even after that.
Okay. Got it.
So it was a process. And then a few months after we got separated, right before my ex and I got divorced, I moved back to the city. So that was the summer of 2013. I got an internship. I worked at a JCC in Manhattan through, like, Footsteps. So Footsteps is a nonprofit organization that helps people, an amazing life-saving organization that helps people who are leaving the ultra-Orthodox community. And with their support, I got an internship at JCC Manhattan, which was one of my first jobs. So, that was a year later. I'm mixing up things. That was summer of 2014. Summer 2013, actually, my first job was, like, working at a online sales company. Not gonna go into, but that, so like when I got that job, I moved back into with my parents. So I lived for a whole year, a year and a half. I was back living in Williamsburg. So, but here's the thing. At that time, I wasn't religious anymore. My parents knew it. I didn't really live in Williamsburg. I wasn't part of the Hasidic community. I was perhaps part of the very hipster-like North Williamsburg community, which is not religious. But I still lived there. And then I started focusing more and more on education. I ultimately finished my high school equivalency, kind of my high school studies towards the end of 2013, got my high school diploma, and then for the kind of like spring semester of
Sorry, we got frozen. Just something with a connection. Let's hope that maybe will come back to us, and we'll talk a little bit about education in general, and I will ask Abby about her education and learning in Columbia University, because obviously the way her learning process in yeshiva was absolutely different, but yet I believe she acquired a lot of necessary skills to study in Columbia. I think we lost Abby. We will try to connect to her once again, just in a second. Let's see if she will connect.
Here you go. I don't know why. I put it to charge. So
it's okay. It does.
I'm on my tablet now. Let's see if this works. Sorry, I don't know what's going on here. Okay, give me a second.
No worries. I just mentioned while you were lost in transition that you went to Columbia University, and I believe, and I want to ask you this question, that although of course studying in yeshiva was absolutely completely different process from you studying in Columbia, but I think that some of the skills that you acquired by learning and memorizing the texts while you were in yeshiva probably helped you in a sense with the process of being a Columbia student. What is your take on it?
So I was going to get to that about the whole thing about Columbia. Here's what I would say. The education that I got in the Hasidic community and the yeshiva didn't help me at all. Obviously, like I needed to, the education, like the education itself, I needed to catch up. I needed to start everything from scratch, get my high school diploma. Then I started to say like the spring semester of 2014, I spent with college prep courses, which was the first time I was in any setting that was giving me a basic kind of like experience of like a traditional classroom and so on. It was only, and then the semester after that, so the fall 2014 is when I started college at Columbia. But you are right. So like I would say the biggest benefit that I had from the yeshiva education was being able to sit hours and hours. And
I'm sure.
I could pull an all-nighter, so to speak. So when I was in college, almost every paper that I wrote, every final that I took, I spent a whole night before studying, and it was very easy for me.
Yeah.
I could sit in the library for 10 hours at a time and study without an issue. So I think that is kind of a skill that I did pick up in yeshiva.
Yes, that's exactly what I kind of suspected and thought. And Abby, are you a confident person? And what defines you?
What defines me?
Yes.
In what way?
As a personality, and has your personality changed? Are you still changing? And
well, I think I am who I am, and I always was. And as I said, like I always like to say, and I think for many trans people that is true. I always felt like I'm a girl, so that I guess was always there. I do think that in many ways my approach to life is very, dare I say, joyful, or like there's always this joke that people have with like clothes.
Positive.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's this thing about clothing that people say that I don't know who it is that said that you hold something, if it doesn't bring you joy, throw it out. Like when you have too much clothing or too much stuff at home.
Yeah, declutter.
To me, that's kind of my declutter. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So for me, that's kind of my approach to life. If there's something in life that doesn't bring me joy, let go of it. Whatever that is, people, whatever that is. Like, and I think that is a very important part. If you're talking about more of my hobbies, let's say I love fashion, maybe too much, and it took me a while to like kind of like find my own like
style.
Well, this is actually a good example. I don't know if you can see the top that I'm wearing. This would be like a favorite thing of mine. It's a bit like more, this would be like, I guess, a bit more classic. Like, I like clothing that have like small like features, whatever it is, ruffled like
So very
cuffs or
girly, and you
like bows. Huh?
very girly, and you don't
Oh,
obviously love
definitely.
prints
Yes,
because
yes. So
anytime.
here's
Sorry.
my thing about femininity. I don't think that clothes is what makes someone a girl, but I do think that it's a power to lean into if you choose to do that. Same thing with makeup. I think makeup is an art. I don't think you need to wear makeup to be a girl or to be a guy or to be happy or anything like that. But it could be very powerful. And I think as long as we know that this is not necessarily what makes someone's gender or sexuality so on, but rather something that we can lean into. Yes, I love it. My like colors, like I love like a lot of floral stuff, and then certain shades of pink and red. You will always see me wear that, but also other things I love, like flowy dresses or like some of these other things. So that is a big part. I love cooking with a passion, and I will say like I'm in the
I
very early
saw
stages.
some of the halas that you made. They looked amazing.
Oh yeah, in
Yes, I saw.
Singapore, yeah.
I saw. And what do you like most of being a woman?
Here's so much. That's why I need to say, and I can't overstate that enough. And a lot of people, and I think anyone who has struggled with the gender could get at the simple experience of walking down the streets and being seen as who you are is a very powerful experience, which I guess most people don't struggle with that. And most people just have that from birth. I guess for me, I like the simply being. I just love
Yeah.
being, like to be who I am. Some of the other things that I really admire, and I think something that, first of all, I feel like relationships, and I know girls, we all love to joke about how we're all so dramatic and there's all these drama and passive aggressiveness. It could also be, obviously, I don't think I ever had I ever had an actual experience of being a guy because I never identified as such and always had trouble making friends. But the kind of like female friendships and sometimes the intensity and the beauty of that, could be I'm wrong, and could be some guys maybe have that. I don't really see that. I think that is such a powerful kind of, that like communal feeling that is so strong for so many of us. It's very powerful and something that I really love and appreciate and admire. I say in many ways, being a woman, and I feel the same thing, for example, by being part of the LGBTQ community, being part of the Jewish community, any group of people who for centuries had to fight for our rights, for our ability to be seen, to get equal rights, to get our basic human rights, ends up being a community that is resilient beyond words. To quote my mom, who in her own way is weirdly a feminist, not a second or third wave feminist, but in her own way, she has her own. So she would always tell me that the reason why women give birth, or with a lot of women as opposed to men, is because men would never be able to take the pain, physically or emotionally.
I agree with you, Maya.
She would always say like women are so much more resilient, and I would actually believe that, and I've had the ability to experience that. Well, both in my personal life. And well, there's also the physical aspect of it, which I'm not going to go into that. But I did not like. I don't like to talk about physical transition, but personally, and again, it could also be psychologically because I wanted it. But my life, to say it very briefly, in so many ways, having a life, my hormonal base being feminine and being estrogen as opposed to testosterone, has been eye-opening and life-changing and such a joy in so many ways, with all the mood swings, with all the physical parts that come with it. Again, I don't like to talk. I have certain parts that are different than even most trans women. I'm not going to go into that.
Sure.
But even just that simple experience. But ultimately, the resiliency that we have, and again, that is both for women, it's for LGBTQ community. It's like any group of people who have to fight to be who we are, have to fight for our basic human rights. That is so beautiful.
Wonderful.
And there's many other things that I love, which I not necessarily only like for women, but I guess it's easier to do that as a woman rather than just clothing and like the way, like how you can dress up, how you can explore, again, as I said before, friendships and so many others.
Thank you for that. And what shall we look forward from Abby post-pandemic? What are your plans? And
What are my plans? Well, there's some things that I could share, some things that I can mention and
please,
maybe can get into
please.
trouble. So I'm not going to share too much, but
Okay.
some of the work things in progress. Just signed a deal with one of the biggest studios in the world, and we're going to do a TV show based on my book.
Fantastic.
That's as
So
much
just
as
for
I can say.
all of our listeners, Abby published a book in 2019,
Yeah,
I believe,
this is my book,
right?
Becoming Eve,
Here
published
you
by Steel
go.
Press.
Yes, Becoming Eve: My Journey from Orthodox Rabbi to Transgender Woman. It was published by Steel Press. And here you go. Now it's going to turn into this series. I'm so happy for
Yes,
you.
and
Amazing.
we're also working on some documentary reality stuff on the side that are already like being in the early process of filming. I'm working with a production company, again, a big production company on a totally fictionalized, but like a story set in Hasidic Williamsburg, which is going to be beautiful and amazing. We're working on play based on the book, outside of kind of like based on this specific books. I'm personally working very early stages of a cookbook, where as soon as borders kind of reopen again, I'm fully vaccinated. So we are going to continue with
So
the
then
travel.
I hope to see you again in Singapore then at one
I
point.
hope to come to Singapore again. It was really, I have to say, my experience in Singapore was eye-opening in so many ways. It was one of my favorite places. Mine is the humidity that like is terrible for my hair. It was a really great experience.
I can relate to that. I keep on looking at myself and it's very freezy, yes. But
yeah, and
we
the fact
get
that it
used to
rains
it.
almost like every single day in Singapore.
Yes, it is. Abby, what are your last words of wisdom for our conversation tonight?
I think I will zoom in a bit to what I mentioned in the beginning, and I mentioned several times. It's like focus on celebrating. And I think that goes not just obviously with religious or non-religious practices, but I think with everything in life. I think we should all look at our backgrounds and our traditions and pick up stuff that we like and enjoy and celebrate that, let go of the rest, and know that that is beautiful. I say the same thing about the LGBTQ community. I tell people that I hate tolerance. Don't tolerate me. Tolerance is for lactose and nuts, not for people. We need to learn to celebrate. Celebrate the LGBTQ community, not in spite of who we are, but because of who we are. And the same goes for every group of people, for every person. To learn to celebrate the beauty and focus on the positive and everything in life.
Absolutely. And build this confidence, I suppose, like for all of us. Just, yes, cultivate the confidence through the positivity. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Abby. For everyone of you, for some people who were not able to be engaged with us this evening, I will post the link of our conversation tonight and all the social media. Please, Abby, feel free to share it. And all my conversations, all my episodes are on my Events by Olga Instagram site under conversations or on my feed. So please go ahead and listen to amazing conversations with incredible people from all around the world, and Abby inclusive tonight. I will post this to on my post as soon as we finish. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to definitely look out for the movie and look out for the play, and look out for you to come back to Singapore.
Yes, I'm looking forward. Thank you so much for having me. I apologize for the technology problems. I'm sorry. I forgot to charge my phone overnight. I'm so happy we did this. And yes, I'm looking forward. Or maybe you could come to New York. Just saying.
Well, you know, my boss kids are in New York, so is my mom. So I'm counting the days till I come and visit, of course. I'll let you know. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, again. And thank you, Abby, and have a great day. And send my
and a good night
best
to you.
regards to your girlfriend. She's lovely.
Thank you. Yes, I will. Okay. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.